Hello, I'm Maria Ressa. Welcome to Talk Thursday. Today we have a special guest in the Philippines for a few days, former U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines. He has spent 44 years in the State Department and continues to stay connected to the Philippines. We're with Ambassador John Negroponte. Ambassador Negroponte, welcome to Manila.
Thank you. Thank you.
There is so much I would like to discuss with you. Let me start with what's hot today, which is the conflict in the South China Sea. CSIS says this is the flashpoint of the world. I mean, do you agree with this? Is it this difficult?
Well, it's not easy. Obviously, it's been a source of tension. On the other hand, these are the kinds of situations that ought to be resolved through negotiation and conciliation. They're conflicting claims. They can be negotiated or even referred to arbitration, as the case may be.
The Philippines today says that it's going to go to the UN UNCLOS for arbitration. Is that a good or a bad move?
Well, I think anything that's designed to try and resolve it by peaceful means could be positive. It obviously has to be met with a corresponding response on the other side, but it takes two to tango.
Right.
But still, it sounds like an interesting and potentially positive development.
China seems to have been extremely aggressive this last year, moving into this with the Scarborough Shoal, what's happening with Japan also.
Mm-hmm.
How do you look at China today?
Well, to me, that is the largest single question confronting American diplomacy and perhaps the diplomacy of many other countries in the world. How to think about China.
Mm-hmm.
This is a country that's likely now to be a major factor on the world political and economic scene for the rest of the century,
mm-hmm.
for the indefinite future. So it's not just how do we react to this situation
Correct.
or that one. It's a question of how should we think about China. And I went with Dr. Kissinger to China in 1972. So I've had a little, and I've been
You're modest. You've been doing this a long time.
at various intervals in the meanwhile. So I've been able to see their evolution. And I think one thing that's happened with China is that for 200 years,
Mm-hmm.
close to 200 years, the country was weak. It was racked by strife, revolution, war, pestilence, all kinds of problems. And it was in a very weak position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And then finally, with the advent of Deng Xiaoping and the reform process in China,
Mm-hmm.
they began to regain their strength. So in a way, what's happening is, in our own minds, we had this image of a relatively weak China for such a long period of time that we now need to go through the adjustment process of
Correct.
thinking about a China, maybe the more normal China, the new normal, if you will, of a much stronger China that's going to want to play an important role on the international scene.
It's interesting you put it that way, and a China analyst once said that this is a 30-year-old man, a 30-year-old body, but 17-year-old mentality for China. Is that a similar way of, do you agree with that, or?
Well, I don't know if I want to get into, I think that China has, and the Chinese way and the Chinese way of thinking and expressing themselves has many things to commend itself. I think the important point, though, is that China is an actor on the world scene. It's one that needs to be dealt with, and we need to be thinking about stratagems that are going to make this some kind of a positive sum game. My predecessor as Deputy Secretary of State was Robert Zoellick, who then went on to be the head of the World Bank, and he invented the phrase responsible stakeholder. He said, he told the Chinese himself, he was in charge of our political dialogue with him, he says, you need to be a responsible stakeholder. It's not enough to just export what you want to the rest of the world and then sort of say, well, I've acquitted my responsibilities. So I think the challenge for our diplomacy, I'm speaking of the United States now, has been to try to encourage them to want to become a full-fledged, if you will, player on the international scene.
Is there reluctance? There seems to be some reluctance.
Well, there is some reluctance because, first of all, they used to give you the argument, the advanced argument that they're just an emerging country,
Correct.
and They've been through years of difficulty, and they don't aspire to play a global role. They have no hegemonic pretensions. Well, that's not really the point. The
Correct.
point is they've reached the level of strength and significance in terms of their economic weight
Correct. And military.
and their military weight
Right.
that they need to engage with others so we have a better, more transparent understanding of what they're up to. And they, in turn, I think, need to understand what it is, and they need to find ways to help make the international community work by itself. The international community and the global system is not on automatic pilot.
Right.
It needs leadership. It needs responsible stakeholders, again, responsible nation states to make it work.
In the South China Sea, the United States has an agreement with the Philippines. How far will the United States go to protect the Philippines in a situation like this?
Well, I mean, the basics are that the Philippines is an ally. It's an
Yes.
important ally. We have 5 allies in the Asia-Pacific region, right? We have Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia. So obviously our relationship is a valuable and important one, and we're going to do what we can to help the Philippines defend itself, defend its interests. And should a crisis situation arise, we're committed under our treaty to at least consult with the Philippines. What we might do further than that, people always try to get you to pinpoint, well, what
Correct.
exactly are you
How
going
far
to
will-
do?
how
And the
far will you
answer
go?
to that is
Yeah.
these are hypothetical questions.
Correct.
You can't put yourself in the place of the President of the United
Yes.
States or the other actors involved at the time, and that's obviously going to depend on the circumstances.
Yes.
But I think the important point is we're strong friends of the Philippines, and we want to help the Philippines deal with this situation.
There's strong commercial interests in the South China Sea, and for example, here in we have Philex working with a British company that is actually talking to CNOOC to try to find a way to look at the oil, the gas deposits that's under the surface and on Reed Bank. Is that one route? Can commercial interests help pave the way for diplomacy?
That's conceivable. I mean, just about any arrangement is conceivable if there's the political will behind behind it to make it happen.
But is it more ideal to have political alliances first before commercial?
Well, the ideal would be to have a complete resolution of the boundaries. For example, in the United States, if you can visualize for a moment the Caribbean,
Yes.
there are a lot of overlapping territorial claims and jurisdictions, and which particularly happened after 1977 or so, when countries started going out to 200-mile jurisdiction, and in a small body of water like the Caribbean, obviously the claims are going to overlap,
Right.
and all of those claims have been resolved by negotiation. So that can happen. That's the ideal.
Right.
But clearly that's not what's happening at this particular moment in time.
Not just with the Philippines, but the other ASEAN nations.
there are many
that
other
claim,
countries.
And Japan.
Yeah, I mean,
also.
there's Japan,
Yeah,
there's Korea,
Korea.
there's Taiwan, there's
Right.
Malaysia, there's
Right.
Indonesia, there's the Philippines, Vietnam. Vietnam is particularly
With
important protagonist in
So
in
how
all
do
of this.
how do you nudge China that has actually shied away from bilateral negotiations? It's gone to ASEAN as a whole, but never actually talked about it, negotiated those boundaries.
Well, I mean, I think you're asking. It's another way of asking, how do you influence a country
Correct.
to adopt one policy or another? And it seems to me that these are conclusions that they're going to have to come to themselves over time. But one of the questions I would ask them, the leaders in China, would be, well, do you really want to be in a state of continuous friction with all of these Southeast Asian countries? Does that serve the broader national Chinese interest, or would there be merit in trying to find some peaceful and satisfactory, peaceful solution. Now, if in the interim there's some resource sharing agreements that can somehow set the territorial and the sovereignty disputes or disagreements off to one side, that's been done. There are
Correct.
cases where that's been done in the past. There is, sort of law of the sea history that goes back on issues like that. Well, that would be yet another approach. But I guess my main question in the case of China, or of any country in the region, is do you really want to have these kind of unresolved disputes, which can sometimes develop in ways that run the risk? Anytime you have a territorial or a jurisdictional difference,
Yes.
you run the risk of a dispute getting out of control.
Yes.
That's
a spark.
the problem.
Yeah. Even if it's accidental. Right, when
And
it's
which
there.
could be accidental.
Correct. Do you think this is part of China's political development? I mean, what we've seen is this seems to fuel heightened nationalism in China. Is this something that will shift with the wind? Is this a phase of
I
development?
honestly, don't know how to explain it. I've heard various theories and hypotheses, among them being that they have these net citizens and the netizens who are agitating for hardline positions.
Online, definitely, we
Yeah,
see it, and
yeah.
on broadcasters.
Yeah,
we
so,
see, yeah.
you who follow those kinds
Yeah.
of things much more closely. So that may be one element. Another is leadership transition.
Yes, they just went through.
Do people feel that in this period of transition that they have to show that they're tough kind of attitude? I don't know, but let's hope that as Mr. Campbell, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, was recently quoted as saying, let's hope that cooler heads prevail. He was referring to the Japan-China situation, which has gotten a little bit dicey.
Yeah, exactly. There are leadership transitions in both China and Japan. There are a lot
All
of
these
leadership.
countries.
Yes. How is the United States looking at that?
Well, I mean, like everybody else who has to deal with this part of the world, you spend quite a bit of time trying to analyze and understand. I mean,
Correct.
what is the significance of the Chinese
Yes.
leadership change? There's a real generational change. This is a new group of people now.
It is,
at
for the next
top,
decade.
who we're going to have to deal with for the next decade.
Yes.
There are a lot of issues out there now in the U.S.-China relationship. It isn't so simple anymore. I mean, back in 1972, when I went out there with Dr. Kissinger, or in 79, when we established relations with China, we were wondering about sort of like basic things, like what are we going to import from this country? Can you imagine now we import hundreds of billions of dollars worth of products? It's become a very complex relationship across a lot of different fronts.